talk a little bit about the rationale, why we're thinking about doing this kind of work between utility programs and energy codes. And some of them are. Code compliance does tend to be low, but we are actually trying to get a much better handle, and we will talk about that tomorrow on the pilot compliance evaluation, pilot studies, what code compliance tends to be. But it does tend to be low for various reasons, more or less associated with lack of resources, complexity of the code, etc. On the other side of this, utilities are facing increasing energy efficiency requirements. Sometimes as much as 2% of energy sales as early as 2015, in some places in the Midwest. Code-related programs can help utility meet these goals. Code compliance realizes the energy potential of policy. I can't emphasize that enough. There's always a lot of thinking and a lot of discussion on adoption, and a lot of effort and resources are put towards adoption, but a code is just words on a piece of paper. Until it gets transferred into a building and built correctly, it doesn't mean a whole lot. So code compliance is a very important and often overlooked portion of this. Utilities bring resources and expertise to the issue. Many times they're involved in new construction programs. As was mentioned earlier, in Iowa, for example, they'll have helping to run training programs on the code and on building science. They can bring a lot of resources and expertise to this issue. And there are very significant potential energy savings. If every state in the Midwest adopted the 2009, but both residential and commercial, you'd probably get the equivalent energy use annually savings of about 1 million households by 2020. That's a lot of households. So there's huge energy potential. Why doesn't this sometimes happen? Utilities may hesitate in supporting improving the energy efficiency of codes because it does tend to make it more difficult for them to meet their goals. So what we're trying to do here is kind of turn that problem around. You know, the idea being that if you have a code, if you're trying to have a new construction program, and you have to get an increment between what the code requires and what your new construction program is, you raise the code, you get a smaller increment. And then the big, huge issue is if utilities engage in specific actions, how do they get credit for energy savings from these code programs? That's, I guess I would call the $64,000 question, but I guess in this case it would be probably closer to the $640,000 question. Sorry. Kind of the basic framework for all this is, one, you need to know that states all have what the relevant state statutory and regulatory requirements for codes and for utility programs are. Lots of stakeholders involved in this. Many of them stakeholders that people, for example, in the codes world are not familiar with. We should be focusing on compliance enhancement. That's one of the big places where energy savings can be found, and to a lesser extent stretch codes. But stretch codes are a tricky issue because in many cases that can only happen in certain places, certain states, and certain jurisdictions. You have to figure out what the appropriate activities are. For example, I know this because I've been told this a gazillion times. Utilities do not want to be code enforcers. They do not want to be code enforcers under any circumstances. So what kind of activities can utilities engage in to help improve code compliance? Then we have to develop a methodology for measuring the energy savings. You improve the code compliance. How do you transfer that improvement in code compliance to actual energy savings? How do you attribute it? Because code compliance over time will often improve by itself. So if utility helps that out, obviously they're probably not responsible for 100% of it. How much of that? And then allocation. Many states have multiple utilities, IOUs, municipals, etc. Different construction occurs in different parts of a state. How do you allocate the savings? Also, I want to point out is, how does a code program differ from typical programs? Codes are typically adopted and enforced by governmental agencies. Most codes programs are voluntary. In a typical codes program, the utility is the organization running it. In a codes, obviously there are multiple organizations. Codes affect all new buildings. Even a new construction program only is for those buildings. It's on a voluntary basis. Those buildings that want to be involved. Customers cannot choose to participate. In this case, utility actions affect adoption and implementation, not the behavior. In other words, a program is trying to change a consumer's behavior in terms of what they purchase or how they build. In this case, utility actions affect adoption or